Hello, my friend. Welcome to Humorously Dull History for Sleep. My name is Stephen Dalton, and it is my hope that as I tell you lots of different facts about particular periods in history tonight, you find me so incredibly boring that you fall asleep very quickly, and maybe even with a smile upon your face. It is humorous history after all. Tonight I'll tell you the humorously dull history of trees. Yes, trees. First appearing roughly 385 million years ago, the tree has gone on to become one of the most successful things to ever stand in one place. Experts agree the secret to their success is patience, combined with a complete lack of alternatives. So, just before we get started, allow yourself to settle into this moment. Leave the day that was behind. Feel the support of whatever you lie upon. If your eyes aren't closed yet, allow them to close. Whatever has been, has been. It's history now. Whatever will be, will be. All you have is this moment, and my voice, so allow your curiosity to be a part of this pleasant experience as I tell you the humorously dull history of trees. Part 1, in which trees take their time becoming trees. The story of trees begins long before there were villages, or tools, or even particularly interesting creatures. It starts around 385 million years ago, in a world where most of the land was still thinking about what it wanted to be. The continents were shuffled into different positions. The air was thick with moisture, and the ground was decorated mostly with ferns and low plants that never stood up straight. At some point, a few plants, though not in any noticeable hurry, decided they might as well try being taller. They didn't rush. They simply added a bit of height over the course of a few million years. The result wasn't anything anyone would recognize as a tree today. They were awkward, with spindly trunks and uncertain branches, like someone had sketched a tree from memory, but hadn't quite finished the drawing. For a very long stretch of time, nothing much else happened. These early trees just stood around in damp, swampy silence. No birds perched in their branches, because birds didn't exist yet. No squirrels scurried up their trunks, because squirrels didn't exist either. They were unbothered by such things. Wind would blow, rain would fall, and the trees would respond with their usual reaction, which was no reaction at all. Eventually, after another leisurely few million years, they developed proper wood. This was quite a big deal in plant terms, though they didn't celebrate. They just continued standing. Some of them became Archaeopteris, an early tree that grew up to 10 meters tall. 10 meters might sound impressive, but it happened at such a glacial pace that even if you'd been there to watch, you'd have had time to invent chairs just to sit and wait for it to finish. The world slowly filled with these quiet wooden beings. Forests appeared, though at the time nobody called them forests, because nobody was around to name anything. There were no hikers admiring them, no lumberjacks sharpening axes, no one complaining about leaves in the gutters. Just trees, standing in clusters, watching nothing in particular for thousands of centuries at a time. Part 2, in which dinosaurs stomp about and the trees couldn't care less. By the time the dinosaurs appeared, around 230 million years ago, trees were already veterans of existence. They'd stood through continental shifts, steamy swamps, and more quiet afternoons than any creature could count. So, when dinosaurs arrived, strutting about with their tails and their important footsteps, the trees didn't greet them with fanfare. They simply continued standing. The great forests of the Jurassic were dominated by conifers, cycads, and early ginkgos. Many of these trees were tall enough to make a sauropod crane its neck a little, which is saying something. But unlike dinosaurs, trees didn't bother chasing anything or trying to impress anyone. They just grew in their own mild-mannered way, letting the dinosaurs do the noisy bit. Giant herbivores would wander into a forest, eat the tops of trees, and wander off again. If a brachiosaurus knocked over a tree, the tree didn't shout or fight back. It simply became a log and let time do the rest. In a forest full of dramatic, roaring creatures, the trees were the only ones keeping a low profile. It suited them perfectly. For millions of years, dinosaurs lived among these forests, and the trees provided food, shade, and a pleasant general atmosphere. But while the dinosaurs went through entire dynasties, trees barely updated their design. A conifer in the Jurassic period looked much the same as a conifer now. They didn't experiment. They didn't need to. Then came the asteroid, which is the sort of thing that gets a lot of attention in documentaries. The dinosaurs didn't fare well. The trees, at least many of them, just carried on. A bit of dust, some dark skies, a few millennia of waiting, and the forests quietly returned. It was possibly the least dramatic comeback in Earth's history. Part 3, in which humans notice trees and immediately start naming things. When humans finally appeared on the scene, many millions of years after the dinosaurs had their noisy era, the trees were still exactly where they'd always been. They hadn't moved an inch. Their approach to existence remained unchanged. Stay upright, grow slowly, and avoid unnecessary fuss. Humans, however, were not built for such restraint. They saw trees and immediately decided something must be done with them. The first thing they did was give them names. Perfectly good trees that had been quietly existing for millennia suddenly became oak, ash, beech, and so on, as if they'd been waiting for someone to hand out labels. People also pointed at them a lot. A group would gather, look at a tall tree, nod meaningfully, and agree that it was indeed a tree. This didn't affect the tree in the slightest, but it seemed to satisfy the humans. Then came the measuring. For reasons that remain unclear, early humans developed a strong interest in finding out how tall trees were, how wide they were, and how old they might be. It's possible they could have spent their time on something else, but the idea of taking a stick and comparing it to a trunk proved irresistible. Trees, as usual, provided no feedback. Before long, people were sitting under them, building homes out of them, and writing stories about them. Entire legends formed around particular trees, usually ones that had done nothing except stand there for a long time. A tree might become the great elm of the valley, or the sacred pine of the hill, simply by not falling over. Part 4, in which trees watch humans discover sharp things. By the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BC, the world's forests stretched across vast continents. In Europe, oak and beech had returned after the glaciers retreated. Across Asia, dense woodlands climbed along river valleys. In the Amazon basin, tropical forests thrived in endless, humid layers. These trees had already been around for millions of years and had no idea they were about to become resources. Human tool-making had been happening quietly for a long time, but during this period, it took a turn toward being more effective. Stone blades became sharper, axes more deliberate. Trees, which had previously only been leaned against or climbed, started to feel the faint, regular tapping of human intent. A trunk that once might have hosted a bird's nest could now expect to be hollowed out into a canoe. In what is now China, broadleaf forests grew thick along the Yangtze. Early communities began clearing small patches to plant millet and rice. The process was slow and unsystematic. A tree here, a tree there. But for trees that measured time in centuries, it was noticeable. In the Americas, people moved through dense forests long before written history. In parts of the Amazon, ancient communities used controlled burns and selective planting to shape the forest subtly, creating what would later be called terra preta. The trees in those regions were not bulldozed or logged. They were nudged, shifted, and slowly integrated into human routines. Africa's savanna woodlands saw similar shifts. Acacias and baobabs watched as small groups gathered beneath their shade, sharpened tools, and occasionally decided that a particular branch would make a good handle. It was not yet industry. It wasn't even agriculture. It was just the faint, early sound of people beginning to rearrange things that had been fine on their own. None of this happened quickly. For the trees, it must have felt like an occasional interruption in their otherwise long silence. One century might see a few more stumps, another, a few more campfires, but they still dominated the landscape. If you looked at a map of the world at the time, it would have been mostly green. In fact, it is said that in my own homeland of Ireland, if I were a little squirrel about 10,000 years ago, I could have gone from the top of the island to the bottom without touching the ground once. The island was so covered in trees. Part 5, in which humans begin the long, slow business of cutting down trees on purpose. By the Neolithic period, around 6000 BC, forests still covered most of the earth. There were oaks all across Europe, some of them already several hundred years into a very long think they had no intention of finishing. There was chestnut and walnut in Asia, eucalyptus in parts of Australasia, and in the Americas and Africa, green in every direction, as far as the eye could see, which is not far on account of the other trees. None of them were doing anything. That was rather the point of them. A tree's entire ambition, then as now, was to remain exactly where it was and get very slightly taller. And at this, they were the finest in the world. It was into this settled arrangement that humans arrived with a new idea. And the new idea was an axe. A family, or a small group, would look at a patch of forest, agree that it would make an excellent field if it weren't so thoroughly full of forest, and set about the matter. It took them weeks. The trees, it must be said, did not make it difficult, nor did they make it easy. They simply stood there being trees, which is the most a tree can offer to either side of a disagreement. And when it was over, they did the one thing they had always been good at, which was to begin, very slowly, growing back, on the theory that they had more time than anybody, and were prepared to prove it. Along the Yellow River in China, woodland was cleared to make way for millet, a small and self-satisfied grain that moved straight in and behaved as though the field had always been its own. In Europe, the broadleaf forests gave ground to the early farmers a few yards at a time, with the unhurried dignity of someone leaving a party who fully intends to be the last to actually go. In the Near East, patches of trees thinned out around the new watered fields, and the fields, being damp and new and pleased with themselves, said nothing about it either. Nobody said much of anything. It was not that sort of era. The wood, for its part, was quietly finding employment. It became the posts that held up the first houses, a steady and dependable line of work that suited it. It became boats, carved from single trunks and pushed out onto rivers to go wherever the river had in mind, the trunk having no opinion on rivers up to that point, and now being given little choice. It became the handles of useful things. Every plank and post and small dependable boat had started its life as a tree that had planned, at most, to stand quietly in one spot for 200 years, and was now seeing considerably more of the world than it had ever applied for. And all the while, the great forests of the Amazon and of Central Africa went on exactly as before, far too large and far too comfortable to take any notice. People walked through them, gathered from them, tidied the odd corner, and left the rest entirely alone, the way you leave alone a very big dog that is sleeping and that you have not been formally introduced to. The trees there remained the largest fact in the landscape, as they had been for ages, and fully intended to go on being. And if the early people supposed, standing in their tidy little clearings, that they were changing the whole wide world, the forests gave not the faintest sign of having heard, and carried on doing the only thing they had ever wished to do, which was nothing, slowly, in the warm, green quiet, for another few thousand years. Part 6, in which humans invent bronze and immediately start making things out of trees. By the time bronze tools appeared, around 3300 BC, humans had become quite efficient at rearranging forests. What once took weeks with stone could now be done more neatly with bronze axes, which were sharper, lasted longer, and made people feel terribly accomplished. The trees, of course, didn't register the difference. An axe is an axe. This was the age when clearing land for crops became more than a passing hobby. In Europe and the Near East, neat patches of farmland appeared where oak and elm had once stood. Across parts of Asia, timber posts began to hold up larger houses, and in river valleys everywhere, boats made from trees started going places their original trunks had never imagined. Timber quietly became a currency of its own. Cedar moved from Lebanon to Egypt on slow, creaking barges. Oak traveled down rivers in rafts. Bamboo was bundled and floated across streams in Asia. No one rushed. Timber took its time. It always does. And so did the people moving it. For the trees themselves, none of this felt particularly dramatic. A tree might spend a century growing in a forest, then one day find itself as part of a roof beam in a city it had never heard of. It wasn't a fall from grace. It was just a change of address. Meanwhile, vast stretches of forest remained untouched. Much of the Amazon, Congo, and boreal regions of the north continued their long, quiet work of photosynthesis. Most trees would live and die exactly where they started, without ever being measured, named, or carried anywhere. Humanity's timber trade, impressive as it felt to the humans, was still just a faint ripple on a very big map. Part 7, in which trees watch the first cities appear and remain largely unimpressed. By the time the first cities began to form along the rivers of Mesopotamia and the Nile, around 3000 BC, the trees were already very old hands at existing. They'd stood through entire ice ages, continents rearranging themselves, and the entire dinosaur debacle. So the appearance of people laying down bricks didn't make much of an impression. In Mesopotamia, most of the land around the cities was open floodplain, but groves of date palms lined the irrigation canals. They'd grown there long enough before anyone arrived to take notes. Over time, the trees found themselves in neat rows, not because they'd moved, but because humans were the sort of creatures who liked arranging things The trees, as always, stayed put and let themselves be arranged. Along the Nile, sycamore figs grew in the soft soil near the riverbanks. These trees had been growing there for thousands of years without instruction. Every flood deposited new silt, and the trees simply responded by standing a little taller and living a little longer. Long before priests wrote down anything about gods or rulers, the sycamores had already been quietly counting the seasons in their rings. The cedar forests of Lebanon were older still. Their roots reached deep into the mountains, their branches catching light from suns that shone on no human city. Traders hadn't arrived yet. Axes hadn't echoed in their trunks. The trees were simply there, as they had been for millennia, swaying a bit when the wind remembered them. The earliest human civilizations were noisy in their own way. Clay tablets, mud bricks, priests making speeches. But the trees did what they always did, ignored it. They didn't need temples or walls. They already had what they required. Time. Lots of it. Part 8, in which trees quietly become involved in civilization. By the first millennium BC, humans had begun to think of themselves as quite organized. Empires appeared, roads were built, temples rose up, and naturally, trees were quietly roped into all of it. They didn't sign up, of course. No tree ever filled out of form. But if something needed to be built, written on, or shaded under, a tree was usually involved, somewhere in the background. In Greece, olive trees were treated with the sort of respect normally reserved for people who own important land. They provided oil, shade, and something for philosophers to sit beneath while making pronouncements. The trees, unimpressed, carried on producing olives at their usual pace. In Rome, timber was a serious business. Forests were cut, transported, and inventoried with solemn efficiency. Roman surveyors measured trees, logged their dimensions, and made notes on wax tablets, which, naturally, also came from trees. Roman ships, scaffolding, aqueduct supports, and even catapults owed their structure to a tree that, some decades earlier, had probably been minding its own business on a hillside. In China, ancient cypresses and pines were planted around temples and gardens with a kind of ceremonial care. They were symbols of endurance, not because the trees had any opinion on this, but because people liked the idea of something that stayed still. In the Americas, early civilizations built entire cities in forested landscapes, sometimes clearing, sometimes adapting, but always living alongside the trees rather than apart from them. Through all of this, the trees themselves did not speed up, slow down, or adjust their schedules. They simply continued the same long game they'd always played. Grow, stand, and eventually fall over. Human civilization came to see them as sacred, useful, and occasionally in the way. But to the trees, these were just different flavors of background noise. The forests that remained beyond the cities still outnumbered the people by a vast margin. Empires rose, traded timber, carved stories into bark, then disappeared. The trees carried on. A pine standing outside a Roman settlement had no idea that it was living through what textbooks would later call history. To the tree, it was just a Tuesday. Part 9, in which trees become the infrastructure nobody talks about. By the Middle Ages, trees had become the quiet backbone of human advancement. Almost everything practical relied on them. Timber framed houses, it lined bridges, and it formed the keels of ships that stitched coastlines together. Firewood kept homes warm, forges hot, and bread ovens working through long winters. Even tools built to shape other tools depended on wooden handles. In monasteries across Europe, managed woodlands were maintained with a kind of calm diligence. Logs were marked, counted, and scheduled for felling years in advance. Timber was stored, dried, and rationed carefully, because entire communities ran on it. Without trees, the rhythm of monastic life, eating, brewing, building, would have faltered. Royal National forests were another matter entirely. Officially, they belonged to kings. In practice, they were the backdrop to centuries of rules, rights, and quiet negotiations. A peasant might be allowed to gather a fallen branch, but not cut a standing one. Hunters were permitted in some seasons, but not others. Trees were at the center of entire legal systems, though they never appeared in court. Beyond Europe, the story echoed in different forms. In Japan, carefully managed cedar groves supported temple construction for centuries. In parts of West Africa, hardwood trade routes were already well established. In the Americas, woodland resources shaped settlement patterns long before colonial powers arrived. Civilizations didn't just happen near forests. They were made possible by them. It's easy to imagine medieval towns as stone and iron, but almost everything between those materials was wood. Roof beams, scaffolding, carts, wagons, barrels, bridges, doors, wheels, books, even the ink-stained desks in scriptoria. If the trees had vanished, human history would have paused awkwardly and gone very cold. Part 10, in which trees carry empires across the water. When the age of exploration began, it wasn't powered by sails alone. It was powered by trees. Every ship that left a European harbor in the 15th and 16th centuries was, at its core, a carefully arranged forest. Oak, pine, spruce, teak. Entire voyages were made possible because, centuries earlier, a tree had taken root somewhere. Naval timber was chosen with extraordinary seriousness. Oak was prized for its strength, pine for its straight masts, spruce for planking. A single ship would require thousands of trees, many of which had spent decades growing in quiet, wet places before being turned into a hull. Entire regions were mapped, not just for land, but for their timber reserves. A good forest was as valuable as gold. Shipbuilding yards became organized affairs. with long, slow rhythms. Logs were seasoned for years to make them seaworthy. Craftsmen measured each plank, each beam, each mast, with the precision of people who knew their work would have to cross an ocean. The forests of the Baltic, the Balkans, and North America became central to maritime ambition. And it wasn't just Europe. In Asia, shipbuilders had been working with teak and bamboo for centuries, sending fleets across the Indian Ocean. In the Pacific, Polynesian navigators relied on carefully selected trees for their canoes, crafting them to travel immense distances without ever touching metal. Wherever humans set out to sea, they did so on wood. If you traced every major shipping route of the early modern world back to its beginning, it ended in a forest somewhere. Trees didn't just shape landscapes. They shaped the reach of entire civilizations. Every colonial power, every trading network, every grand expedition rested on something that once had roots and leaves. And yet, for all the flags and names attached to these voyages, the real material that held them together was the same as it had been for millennia. Timber, quietly grown, meticulously cut, unavoidably necessary. Part 11, in which the Industrial Revolution declares itself modern, but still smells of wood. The Industrial Revolution liked to present itself as a bold new age of coal, iron, and steam. But behind the smoke and speeches, it still leaned heavily on trees. Steam engines might have burned coal, but the mines were held up by timber beams. Railways ran on wooden sleepers, and the factories that turned out iron tools were, more often than not, built on wooden frames that creaked politely every time someone walked past. The railways in particular became one of the largest consumers of timber in history. For every mile of track, hundreds of wooden sleepers were needed. Each one had once been a tree that might have imagined a nice quiet retirement in a forest somewhere, not a lifetime spent being occasionally rattled by passing trains. Furniture makers, meanwhile, saw no reason to modernize at all. as iron and steel strutted around, wood quietly continued to hold up every table, cupboard, and chair. Entire industrial towns were full of carpenters who claimed, quite reasonably, that their work was older, better, and less likely to rust. Paper production also surged, with newspapers, pamphlets, and ledgers multiplying. Trees found themselves turned into an ever-increasing number of printed opinions. A single tree might once have quietly shaded a riverbank. Now it was being told about municipal council meetings on page 3. Even the great steamships of the 19th century, those proud symbols of progress, relied on timber for decking and interior fittings. Iron may have framed the age, but wood gave it a floor to stand on and somewhere to put the furniture. The revolution was loud, fast, and sooty, but trees were still everywhere in it, just less photogenic. They had quietly shifted from being the headline act to the stage crew, keeping the whole performance upright. Part 12, in which trees become the wiring, the paper, and most of the furniture. By the late 19th century, cities were growing fast, and trees, as usual, were given all the jobs that required being useful without showing off. Iron and concrete strutted up into the skyline, but timber quietly filled in all the gaps. Paper was everywhere by now. Newspapers, novels, bureaucratic forms. Entire forests were converted into reading material for people on trains pretending to be busy. A single trunk could become a shelf full of respectable Victorian literature, or, more tragically, several decades' worth of tax records. Furniture production became an industry in its own right. People who had once cut down a single tree to make a chair were now doing it by the thousands, giving living rooms across Europe and America an identical sense of wooden respectability. Factories filled with sawdust and men in waistcoats turned forests into wardrobes with brisk efficiency. Meanwhile, in rural areas, people still relied on trees the way they always had, for warmth, shelter, and the occasional satisfying creak of a wooden door in the wind. Modernity might have changed the view from the street, But behind the bricks and lamps, it was still wood, holding everything together. Part 13, in which trees return to themselves. Long before there were ships, sawmills, telegraph poles, or even half-decent paperwork, trees simply lived in forests. And even now, after everything humans have built, the vast majority of them still do. Most trees have never been counted, measured, or made into anything. They grow in mountain valleys, along rivers, in tangled rainforests, on wind-swept hillsides, and in quiet little corners no one visits. In these places, the world moves at a different pace. A seed drifts into the soil, finds its footing, and begins a patient climb toward the light. Rain comes and goes. Wind shifts, and animals pass through. Years fold into decades, and the tree becomes part of something larger. A forest that doesn't need to be named to exist. Forests have always been generous hosts. They keep the air cool. They share their shade freely. They house everything from small beetles to wandering owls. Moss softens the ground. Birds leave gossip in the branches, and fallen trunks quietly turn themselves back into soil. It isn't a drama. It's just the long, steady way of things. The funny part, if you can call it that, is that while humans often act as though they've arranged everything, the trees were here first, and will still be here long after the last bit of paperwork blows away. They don't need permission to keep going. They just get on with it, politely ignoring our sense of importance. And in truth, they've always given more than they've taken. Every breath, every bit of shade, every stretch of woodland path owes something to their quiet work. It's not a sad story. It's a long one, and it's still unfolding. Part 14, in which the history of trees doesn't really end. We've acknowledged that humans have had their part to play in the history of trees. But the history of trees is older than continents as we know them. They watched the seas shift, the dinosaurs come and go, and the first humans learn how to hold a sharp edge. They've been there for campfires, temples, ships, railways, and all the tidy piles of paperwork that followed. But through it all, they've quietly continued their own story. Forests remain one of the few constants in a world that keeps changing its mind. When empires collapse, the trees grow back over the stones. When cities rust, roots find the cracks. When a stretch of land is left alone long enough, it eventually fills with green again. Trees have shaped our history without ever needing to direct it. We've built with them, written on them, traveled on them, sat beneath them, and told stories about them. In many ways, the history of humans is stitched neatly into the history of trees, not the other way round. And what's quietly reassuring is this: even after all the noise, there are still vast forests that have nothing to do with us at all. Trees are still out there, on their own timelines, taking their sweet time. Long after today becomes tomorrow's old story, they'll still be growing rings, leaf by leaf, year by year. So, if this history has taught anything, it's that trees are not a footnote in human history. We are a chapter in theirs.